this morning we're going to hear from global futurist Dr. Keith Suter. He's going to provide his take on what he sees as the key geopolitical issues that we all need to be across, whether it's currency woes or North Korean tensions or, of course, global trade wars. In terms of format, Dr. Suter has prepared a presentation. We'll be hearing from him for about 40 minutes, and then after that I'll open it up to Q&A. As always, please use the conference app on your phones, and just a note, we are of course in a different hall, so make sure that you select Hall B and submit your questions there. Please put your hands together for Dr. Keith Suter.
Thanks, Dale. I join with others in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay tribute to their elders for the wise stewardship of the land. There's a handout in front of you, and I'm going to be talking to the handout for the next 40 minutes. So I've been asked to give a geopolitical overview, and I had to select three topics which seem to be top of mind. One is the risk of new trade wars. The second, obviously, has to be around Donald Trump somehow. And then thirdly, a bigger question about, is democracy in decline? As Eva has pointed out, we don't get too many civil disobedience issues in Australia at the moment. Is there in fact this feeling that people are just not interested in the political process? So starting off then and working my way through the handout. So trade wars now, there's a new risk of trade wars. This is a profound threat to the global economy. If you saw yesterday's Financial Review, there was a very useful summary of some of the problems for the emerging market. So Donald Trump has said trade wars are good and easy to win. It's been widely criticised by business leaders and economists, and it has been done mainly in retaliation against China. But China is only the 13th largest supplier of steel to the United States. Most of the big suppliers are actually American allies, Canada, EU and Japan. And the reason why there's a lot of anger is because the United States has actually used a national security provision to be able to introduce these trade sanctions. But the national security is actually being used against Canada, EU and Japan. The bottom line is that if something does not make economic sense, look for the underlying politics to explain what is happening. So before getting on to the politics, let me just make a couple of general comments. One is the whole issue of free trade versus protectionism. It's a long-running issue in many developing countries. It was a controversy in the lead-up to Federation of Australia in 1901, disagreement between free trade New South Wales and protectionist Victoria. So we have got this dilemma within our own political culture. And there are no easy answers. Every free trade agreement ends up with winners and losers. For example, when Australia began reducing its protectionist tariffs in the 1970s, we destroyed pretty well the Australian textile industry. So if you're working in the rag trade, you were a loser. On the other hand, if you were buying clothes, you were a winner, because we could suddenly import cheap Bangladesh cotton items, for example. So we're all able to wear cheaper clothes. But it was at the cost of the rag trade. So that's the dilemma that we have. There are always winners and losers. You can never have an economic policy which guarantees that everybody will win. So if you look at the bigger picture of the debate over trade wars, you basically got three ways of looking. One is what we might call the globalist point of view. You see that with the European Union, Jared Kushner, who's Trump's son-in-law, and the former economic advisor for President Trump. These are people who are just believing in, look, let's create one global economy. You cannot solve problems on your own. You've somehow got to work with others and try to create some sort of new economic system. That's one approach. The second approach is the rationalist approach, what's called economic rationalism, new right thinking, which we see mainly with Australian Liberals and parts of the Labor Party. The view is leave it all to the market. We have no way of knowing what's going to happen, just leave it all to the market and somehow have faith that it'll all work out all right. So don't worry about that big picture of global issues. You just try to maximise your own way of thinking. The meek might inherit the earth, but they won't get the mineral rights. Do unto others before they get a chance to do it unto you. A third point of view is the nationalist point of view, which is the one that is now gathering steam. We see it with Donald Trump, we see it in Australia with Pauline Hanson, we've seen it in the United Kingdom with the Brexit supporters. These are people who are saying, look, come home America, or come home Australia, come home, focus on ourselves, don't bother with all these foreign arrangements, let's just build up our own country in our own way, make America great again, or as Putin would say, make Russia great again. Don't worry about trying to cooperate with others. So they are the three dominant ways of looking at the world, be it in economics or politics, but particularly economics, and particularly the issue of trade. So they're just two general comments. One is that free trade versus protectionism, that goes on all the time as a debate, and it's never going to be settled easily. And then secondly, I've introduced you to three ways of thinking. Now, hopefully, as I was explaining all of that, you were working out which of those three would apply to you. I think most of us in this room would be coming under the heading of globalist, because we take the view that you've got to have foreign investment in here, we've got to have investment overseas, etc. So we tend to be, I think, many of us in this room may be globalists, but there may be some secret Trump supporters here. Well, let's look at the politics of all of this. Remember, if something doesn't make economic sense, look at the politics. So in November of this year, we have what are called the mid-term elections. So mid-term, because it's the middle of a presidential term. Remember, dates for the American elections are fixed in the Constitution. So we've known for 200 years that we would have a mid-term election this year. So 1/3 of the Senate and all the lower house come up for election every 2 years. Voting is not compulsory, so it's a question of getting the voters energised. Remember that more Americans used to vote in American Idol than vote in presidential contests. The skill of Trump was to exploit what's called the grievance narrative of the traditional Democrat blue-collar supporters. Monday night had a brilliant Four Corners interview with Steve Bannon, who was the genius behind Trump's campaign. I think Bannon is super bright. I don't necessarily agree with him, but I recognise intelligent people when I see him. He is the one who saved Trump in 2016. The problem is that Bannon kept telling everybody he saved Trump, and eventually Trump sacked him. You can only have one genius in the White House. So what is interesting is that Bannon was able to get traditional blue-collar Democrat voters to vote for Donald Trump. As with the UK Brexit campaigners, he recognised that money is not the only thing in life, and so operated culturally. So here you got, again, this big difference. We make the assumption that everybody at the end of the day is motivated by money. No. So we see in Brexit, for example, people voted to leave the European Union even though they knew it was going to cost them money, but they get rid of all these damn foreigners. The most common language in Britain now, after English, is Polish. Get rid of all those damn foreigners. So people vote culturally. We see the same in the United States. A lot of Democrat blue-collar supporters voted Republican, voted for Trump, because they were sick of political correctness and all the other issues. The tariff makes little economic sense. Remember, I've already warned about trade wars. The main target, China, won't feel it. But it does make political sense because Trump is keeping it faith with his supporters. Trump is encouraging steel workers to believe that they should support the GOP, that's the Republican Party, grand old party, candidates in November, and not the Democrats. So he's actually splitting that Democrat vote. Mrs. Clinton failed to recognise the threat that Trump was in 2016. Hence Trump's ability to win, albeit closely. It was the biggest political upset in American presidential campaigning since 1948, when Harry Truman got re-elected. That was the magnitude of that Trump victory. And now Trump is talking about a trade war. Those of us with a sense of history, number 5 on the handout, is worrying, we will worry about Smoot-Hawley. Willis Hawley and Reed Smoot in 1930 introduced American tariffs. The Republican president at the time didn't like the idea, but he didn't veto it. Then as now, the legislation was opposed by business leaders. The legislation was blamed for prolonging the Great Depression because other countries followed the US tariff example. That we ended up with a trade war throughout the 1930s. Some of the post-1945 trade negotiations have revolved around reducing the impact of that trade war. So we have spent the years since 1945 trying to undo the damage that we created back in the 1930s. Therefore, although the tariffs may seem small today, they could be the opening salvo of a trade war that jeopardises the global economy. Australia is heavily reliant on international trade and needs to be careful it does not end up as collateral damage. So my first point is to monitor this emerging trade war between the United States and China, because I think it's got a capacity, with the fragile global economic recovery we've got at the moment, to damage the global economy. My second point is to look at President Trump. Naturally, whenever my viewers encounter me in the street, the question is always around what's happening with Donald Trump. So I'm going to start off with this question of the Russian connection. There's been consistent speculation that Putin has some sort of influence over Trump. In July of this year, we had the Helsinki summit. For the first time in recent history, Trump insisted on a private 2.5-hour meeting with the Russian leader, with only interpreters present. So there'd been no prior work done by what are called the Sherpas, the public servants, and the experts who normally meet beforehand. So we don't know what, if anything, was agreed to at the Helsinki meeting. At the media conference, Trump disavowed his own intelligence community over alleged Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election and apparently preferred the word of Mr. Putin. Trump also displayed a lack of support for NATO, a lack of criticism of Russian behaviour in Ukraine, a lack of criticism for the July 2014 downing of the Malaysian flight. Remember, Australia is leading the campaign on bringing those Russians to justice over the downing of that plane. Trump made no reference to the downing of MH17. And then we have the alleged Russian involvement in the 2016 presidential election campaign. What, if anything, is Russia's leverage over Trump? Well, it may be financial. Trump's notorious business model of declaring bankruptcy and then moving on to the next enterprise meant that American banks would not lend to Trump by the end of his business career. And so he had to borrow money, probably Russian money. So there, again, ABC TV have done a very good job in exposing the links between Trump and the Russian business and mafia communities. Trump has refused to publish his financial details. Previous presidents have done so, Trump hasn't. So there may be that link. There's also, secondly, the issue of blackmail. Putin may have information on Trump's sex life, not just in Russia, but his other activities. Remember, there's an extensive network of espionage that goes on. So the Americans spy on everybody, the Russians spy on everyone, the Chinese spy on everyone. So who knows what they've picked up about President Trump's interest in women. Putin may have information on Trump's links with the mob, mainly in the United States, as a result of Trump's business in New York construction, which is very much mob-dominated, and also the casino industries. Now, there are suspicions about this Russian connection began with Putin's support for Trump early on in the campaign, July 2016. Putin would have preferred Trump to win the election rather than hardline Hillary. If Hillary Clinton had won, we would be in an even worse situation with Russia. She has surrounded herself with hardliners. So we would by now have more of a confrontation with Russia than we do have with Trump. Anti-Trump Republicans and then pro-Clinton supporters commissioned the so-called Steele dossier on the Russian links, which revealed or alleged all sorts of things about Trump's behaviour with prostitutes in Russia. Some of Trump's campaign people were known for their East European links, which is Paul Manafort, who's recently just been found guilty of fraud charges. And he'll spend the rest of his life probably in jail. But were these suspicions overstated by an angry Clinton team and pro-Clinton media resentful at her loss? Remember, the November 2016 election result was very traumatic in the United States. I teach American students. We had classes in America cancelled the morning following that election. People were in a state of shock. Students and faculty could not concentrate on anything else because Trump had been elected. Remember, it's a huge shock. So people were saying, how on earth could this have occurred? And so you start blaming the Russians or whatever. So Robert Mueller, who used to be an FBI director, has been appointed to investigate the link between Russia and the campaign that run by President Trump. Special investigations can run on for years. 35 people so far have been charged, and of course Paul Manafort has been found guilty of offences not related to Russia. But what happens is that when the special investigator shines a spotlight on you, suddenly all sorts of other things come to light. And Paul Manafort doesn't fill in tax returns and keeps money in secret bank accounts overseas. Nothing to do with Russia, but he's been caught up in that spotlight. Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, is under investigation for election fraud. This is where it gets complicated, for allegedly paying hush money to one of Trump's female friends, Stormy Daniels, without declaring the money in the election expenses. Paying hush money is not illegal in America. But if you do pay it during an election campaign, you've got to declare it in your election return. So by all means, fraternise with adult film stars, but if you're going to pay them hush money, you've got to declare it in your election expenses. This is a symbol of how people are going to get caught up in so-called minor legal offences. This investigation is going to become a lawyer's picnic. 60% of all the world's lawyers live in the United States. This will drag on for years and paralyse the US government. So what is the risk of impeachment? So impeachment means that the House of Representatives determines whether a president should go on trial for allegedly committing treason, bribery and other high crimes and misdemeanours. Those latter crimes are not defined in the Constitution. So there's ambiguity there. So that's the House of Representatives. So they become the prosecutor. The President actually then goes on trial in the Senate with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court acting as the President of the Senate. 2 presidents have gone on trial in the Senate, Andrew Johnson immediately after the American Civil War and Bill Clinton. Both were acquitted. Richard Nixon resigned, if you remember, that's Watergate, resigned before going to trial. The numbers are so far lacking for this process to get underway. Remember, you've got to get the numbers in the lower house. The Democrats think they can capture the lower house in November, which means that when the new lower house is sworn in January, the process will begin. Trump remains very popular with his Republican base, and so some voters will not be happy with a traumatic impeachment process. That'll get them out to vote in November. They know that if they don't vote and the Democrats do well, you'll end up with an impeachment process. Prosperity trumps morality. In other words, a lot of Americans are saying, yes, Trump is a sleazebag, but the economy seems to be growing. As long as the boom continues, that support will continue. Remember Clinton, when he had problems with Monica Lewinsky, President Clinton, a great leader of men and a great follower of women, he was aided by a strong economy, and that helped to ensure. You've got to get 2/3 of the Senate to vote for an impeachment, for his dismissal. I don't think it's going to occur. By the way, since this handout was produced, we've had debate about the 25th Amendment, so let me just add in a little footnote. The 25th Amendment to the American Constitution deals with a president who is incapacitated. This, of course, arose after the assassination of President Kennedy. What would have happened if Kennedy had been shot but not fatally wounded, but unable to continue the work as president? The 25th Amendment was then created after the Kennedy assassination to deal with a situation where a president is incapacitated but is still alive. What is the mechanism by which the president can be removed because he or she cannot fulfil their office as president? The 25th Amendment therefore stipulates that the vice president and cabinet can seek congressional approval for the removal of the president. The debate about President Trump turns on, does he have early onset dementia? Is there a problem with the way that he's thinking and behaving? So keep an eye on this. This is another route. So you've got the impeachment issue, which I think is going to be a waste of time. And now you've got the debate over the 25th Amendment, which was provoked by yesterday's article in the New York Times. The warning I give you is that whatever happens, you're going to end up with the American government being paralysed. At a time when you need to have clear action by a government, you're instead going to get chaos. So during an earlier impeachment, which is Watergate, I was in Vietnam. So here we had the Commander-in-Chief under threat of dismissal. In the end, of course, he resigned. But you got the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces fighting for his life. We've got a war going on in Vietnam. And yet we've got people back home in America thinking only of impeachment. The problem for America is they can only think of one thing at a time, which means that we run the risk next year of having the country, America, paralysed by this issue of impeachment or the implementation of the 25th Amendment. Because remember, all of that's uncharted. We've never used that amendment before. So keep an eye open for that. There is also a broader issue, which is number 12 on the handout, which is distrust in American institutions. Putin is not only making Russia great again, he also wants to undermine Western institutions. I don't think that Putin played a key role in the 2016 election victory. But the numbers are so small, about 60,000 people in 3 states pushed Trump over the line. So even a small role by the Russians may well have helped get Trump elected. But it's worth bearing in mind that empires die from suicide rather than murder. They lose the will to govern, and they just basically die through debt and through a lack of will, lack of vision, rather than murder. That's how the British Empire went down, the French, etc. The Dutch, they all go that way. American institutions have been in decline since the Vietnam War and President Johnson's so-called credibility gap, where he was making statements about Vietnam, which in fact were not correct. And then in 1969, we get Senator Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, the Chappaquiddick scandal, when he contributed to the drowning of a staffer. It has been made worse by the 2003 Iraq weapons of mass destruction fraud, and of course the current intelligence agencies and surveillance scandals. Americans are losing faith in their institutions. Meanwhile, not all Western populations regard Russia as the evil empire, and so there is some sympathy for Russia's strong leader. There is disillusionment with the sloppiness of feeble Western democracies. So let me now move back to a big picture issue, which is democracy in decline? So we've had the rise and perhaps decline of democracy. The second half of the 20th century saw remarkable growth in democracies around the world. We have more democracies in the world than ever before. But some people are saying the tide is now turning towards more authoritarian government. Lowy Institute in Sydney has showed that only 52% of younger Australians agree that democracy is the preferable form of government. So you don't have too much support among younger people who feel alienated from the political process. And one has to admit that democratic experiments have an uneven record. The UK tried to create democracies in its former African colonies. Almost all of them have failed. In 1991, we get the collapse of communism. Now it's become a quasi-dictatorship under Mr. Putin. 2010, we had the Arab Spring. I remember speaking at one of our gatherings here, talking about the Arab Spring, a whole new wave of change coming through the Arab world. I got that wrong. It's largely failed. Been very little progress made. The Arab world remains still the biggest region for a lack of political development. And then you get Hungary's Viktor Orban boasting that he is creating an illiberal state. Not a liberal state, an illiberal state. Meanwhile, we've got the growth of populism. So populism began in the 1890s in the United States. So we had the rural population and Democrats against the urban elite Republicans. Very interesting. Again, I refer back to Monday night's discussion, because Bannon is talking about the Republican Party as the Workers' Party. So they've taken the support from the Democrats. In the old days, the Republicans used to be bankers in northeast United States, hard people from the business community, disapproved of spending money on anything, be it wars or welfare. And now we've seen this complete change. And the Republican Party under Bannon and Trump has been reinvented as the party of workers. So populists are concerned about the relative decline in economic and social standing. The American economy is booming, but not necessarily American pay packets. The reason for the low unemployment rate is that many Americans are working 2 or 3 jobs. That's why you've got so many people employed and such a low unemployment rate. But the problem is that they are having to work incredibly long hours. You've also got nationalism, you've got xenophobia, the fear of foreigners, often with a charismatic leader. President Trump comes into that category. Populism often grows in a time of crisis. For example, in the 1950s, we had in the United States McCarthy and the Red Scare. Trump today has issues of immigration and Islam. In Australia, we have asylum seekers. Remember, we do not have a problem with asylum seekers. We are a country surrounded by a giant moat. Only a handful of people ever make it into Australia. America is different. Somebody enters the United States legally or illegally at the rate of 1 every 18 seconds. They do have problems. We don't. And of course, many of those workers are actually welcomed by big business. How are the fast food chains going to operate without those cheap foreign workers? And of course, today we have the issue aided by hysteria in the 24/7 media and social media. And also, of course, I guess a risk to superannuation trustees. There's a widespread disapproval of some of the work that goes on in the superannuation industry, as we've seen with the Royal Commission. Let's deal with the issue, a number of 3 things. 1, globalisation. Politicians come to office but do not necessarily come to power. We have seen a rearrangement of power within society, but this has not been explained to the voters. The people who run a country often do not stand for election. So the military, finance, civil service, superannuation industry are all part of what President Trump calls the deep state. In England, we call it the establishment. The establishment has been popularised by that program, Yes Minister, which some people think is a comedy, but it's actually a documentary. And it shows the power of the civil service. President-elect Bill Clinton, having spent a year campaigning on the economy to win the 1992 election against one of the most popular presidents in American history, which is George Bush Sr. Remember, he just won the war in the Middle East. He met with his advisors and he'd laid out what he was going to do. And his advisor said, no, you can't. You cannot do that. And he then, in this immortal phrase, says, you mean to tell me that the success of my program and my re-election hinges on the Federal Reserve and a bunch of effing bond traders? Clinton has spent a year campaigning on the economy, but didn't know how the economy operated in the United States. Frightening. And the power of the bond traders and the Reserve Bank. And of course, Clinton then dismissed his proposals in the election campaign and introduced reforms that fitted in with the bond traders and the Reserve Bank. But of course, they damaged the link between the Democrat Party and the traditional blue-collar worker. And Mrs. Clinton paid that price in 2016. Governments share their role with transnational corporations. Most of you I see are wearing a label of one of them on you, JP Morgan, transnational corporation. You also have international organisations like the European Union or the World Bank, and non-governmental organisations like the National Rifle Association. The NRA in the United States has defeated every president who's tried to introduce gun control. So in other words, Trump has come to office, but he hasn't necessarily come to power. And unfortunately, our voters get misled by the media into thinking that somehow elections are really that significant, whereas in fact the real people who are running the country are not standing for election. This has given rise to a discussion about whether or not humans are suited to democracy. The United States is the great republic, but it never calls itself the great democracy. The framers of the Constitution created a mezzanine structure called the Electoral College between the voters and the actual people who elect the president. So it's interesting that even 200 years ago, when they were writing the world's most sophisticated constitution, in those days they still prevented the mob, the people, from electing the president. It's done through this electoral college, which is what Trump won in November 2016. Not the popular vote. That went to Mrs. Clinton, but he captured that electoral college. So we now have two contrasting pictures of humankind. We have people eager for political news who will make rational decisions based on information. This is the product of the 17th century Enlightenment. The only people I think who still talk in those terms are those who write economic textbooks. The alternative point of view is the view that humans are passive or they're alienated, they're not particularly rational, which we know in the marketing system. You know, how else can we get people to smoke or to drink, terminate their lives early? But we can do it because of marketing, and people are easily manipulated. And this is reflected in modern behavioural economic thinking. These are the two contrasting paradigms. If you want democracy to work, you need to have rational, enlightened individuals. But we don't have rational, enlightened individuals. That's our problem. And number 18, the limitations on government. Politicians make various promises in their campaigns, which they then fail to honour if elected, and the voters get disenchanted. There's a peculiar nature of the political mindset. You have people who want to be someone and those who want to achieve something. So if you want to be someone, you go into politics. And we've seen that very clearly in Canberra in the last few weeks. You want to be someone, you want to be talked about. Donald Trump is a great example of that as well. Then you've got other people who want to achieve something. So they will often go for the long march through the institutions, trying to improve the environment or social welfare or whatever. These are two contrasting individuals. Our politicians are mainly people who want to be someone. When you get into office, you suddenly realise you get mugged. There's actually limitations on what you can achieve. So there are problems. Humans are not rational enough necessarily for democracy, and you end up with politicians getting elected rather than the people who are really going to work for the benefit of society. Number 19, democracy and wealth. The world is 100 times wealthier today than it was 200 years ago. Has democracy created the wealth, or has wealth created the democracy? The military can run a poor peasant society, but not a modern industrial state. So in other words, a poor society can be governed by the military. But if you want to have a modern industrial state, then you need to have a democracy of some sort. When the belly is full, the brain starts to think. What you would have encountered in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Once your basic needs are taken care of, food, shelter, clothing, you work your way up that pyramid and you begin to think bigger thoughts. And that's why I think we've had an outbreak of democracy around the world, even in our own region. South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines, fascist dictatorships have been replaced by by democracies. But what happens if wealthy societies run into problems, such as the 2008 financial crisis, which encouraged the populist Tea Party, which has given us Donald Trump? Some commentators are predicting a bleak future for the world in 3 or 4 decades' time with issues of resources, water, etc. China is developing a social credit system based on facial recognition, internet surveillance and a cashless society. China knows that it could be heading for a turbulent future. So it's got facial recognition, internet surveillance and a cashless society. Every time you spend money in China, they're monitoring what you're spending it on. In the social credit system, you start off with a score of 100. So if you're buying diapers, you're soon to be doing something worthwhile. So therefore, you are earning extra points. On the other hand, if you spend too much time playing video games, you lose your points. And then if I ring someone like Eva, who's got a very low credit rating, I'm sure she hasn't, but she's got a low social credit rating, a voice will come on the line. You are ringing an unreliable person. I will then stop ringing Eva because I will not want to be contaminated with her low social credit rating. This is the basis of the police society which they're developing in China. Keep an eye on this, the social credit system. and how they're going to control people within China. The challenge for us in the Western world is, can it flourish at a time of the concentration of wealth in so few hands? We live in an age of anxious individualism. People have been encouraged to look out for number one, remember, this economic rationalism, and so have very little commitment to the broader society. Therefore, I think there's a risk of taking democracy for granted. A fish doesn't know that it swims in water. So some democratic features work so well, we take them for granted. For example, we have a smooth transfer of power. So if Donald Trump loses the election next time round in 2.5 years' time, he will not be in power after midday on January 20. It's in the Constitution. Midday, January 20, suddenly he's out of power. And you get this transfer by the inauguration of the new American president. It's taken for granted. The same here in Australia. We have perhaps excessively transfers of power. Australia is the democratic coup capital of the Western world. Although it's worth bearing in mind, this goes back to my comment about the deep state or the establishment, that Australia has had many changes of Prime Minister, but we continue to have the longest consecutive run of economic growth in Western history. Politicians come and go, but the deep state remains. We've been blessed by a good financial system, despite what the Royal Commission might be throwing up, blessed by a good financial system and other public servants, etc. So we take for granted you get a smooth transition of power. This will be a challenge in China when President Xi goes. President Xi is now president for life. What happens if he ends up incapacitated? Is he still going to be running the country? Same, of course, with Russia. Putin wants to stay in power almost indefinitely. And it's worth bearing in mind that both Obama and Trump emerged from outside the American political mainstream. Americans have voted 3 times in a row for people outside of the political mainstream. They voted twice for Obama, who in 2008 was ranked 99th out of 100 senators. You can't get more junior than that. Trump, of course, was somebody who came from the world of entertainment, not at all a politician. You can do that in a democracy. We just don't have that in China or Russia. People come up through political parties, communists or whatever. Risk that in an era with so many alternative facts, many voters will simply drop out of the political system and wait until they are told by great leaders what to believe. And remember, the classical Greek democracy didn't last very long. We must not take democracy for granted. I highlight this because it means that as people get angry about democracy, they will also get angry about the superannuation schemes and all the rest of it. You will be caught up, I think, in that broader anger. But let me end on an encouraging note. We have been here before. In 1917, we had the Russian Revolution, and the communists brought Russia into the modern era. And a lot of people were saying we need, well, as you know, the Cambridge Five, the spies in Cambridge, were great supporters of that Russian Revolution. In the 1920s, Mussolini appealed to European voters. He brought order to Italy. Remember, he got the trains to run on time. In the 1930s, Hitler in Germany oversaw a remarkable economic revival. But those last two perished in 1945, and the Soviet system was largely gone by 1991. The doddery, shambolic democracies outlasted them all. The bottom line is you must be prepared to be surprised by what's going to happen in the world of geopolitics. Every board needs a system to listen for the faint signals of change and read broadly and widely. Of the top 20 TV programs in Australia, 17 are on sport, 3 are on cooking. I agree with what Eva had to say about making superannuation more of an interesting subject with good news, with the work being done on climate change. The media are more concerned about sport and cooking. And yet we need to have board members who are alert to these faint signals of change. The world is undergoing major changes, and we need to be on top of those changes for the sake of our members. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suter. Can I just invite the people that are standing, that have been standing the whole time, if you want, this is your opportunity to come and grab a seat. There's some seats at the front if you want some, because The questions are going to go for another 10 minutes, so if you want to grab a seat, now's your opportunity to jump in the front. Thank you to everyone who sent their questions through. I was watching the questions from the back, lots of questions to go through, and we have about 10 minutes on the clock. Just remember, if you do want to participate, you can use the app and just go to Hall B. We'll start with a question here from Michael McQueen. We've seen a lot of unthinkable geopolitical events as a result of Trump. Is there a watershed moment that we should be looking out for? For example, US withdrawing from NATO?
I don't think the US will withdraw from NATO. The deep state won't allow him to withdraw. So NATO will continue to have the United States in it. Don't forget, the United States is often bound by treaties, and it takes years to pull out of treaties. So I'm not expecting the Americans to pull out of NATO. What are the big events? I've given up trying to predict about Donald Trump. You know, if you look at the North Korean issue, for example, he got fooled by North Korea. There's a lovely word going around at the moment called gaslighting. Amanda Carpenter, who's a never Trump Republican, in other words, she is a solid Republican, but she hates Trump. And she talks about how we are being gaslighted, which comes from the entertainment world, about how you're getting lied to and you are following those lies. Trump was beaten by the North Korean leader, who's now a pop star, if you saw him in Singapore. So Trump inadvertently brought the North Korean leader out from the cold, but in fact he hasn't surrendered any of his nuclear weapons. So Trump was warned about the riskiness of dealing with North Korea in this way, ignored that. And that's our problem, that there are not enough adults around Trump to keep him under control. So in terms of Michael's question, who knows what's going to happen in the next 2.5 years?
Another question from Michael. What is your view on China, in particular, the abolition of term limits for Xi Jinping? What reforms will he implement in the coming years? Well,
it's interesting because that's an issue that I touched on, that it's going to be very difficult now with Xi, President Xi is going to be around for an awfully long time. I'm very worried about the state of the Chinese economy. Its level of debt is very high indeed, perhaps 230% of its GMP. So it's very heavily in debt. Now, of course, it has more control over its economy than, say, a more exposed economy like the United States or Australia's. But I am very worried about China in the sense of its economy. But I do think that President Xi is one of the better politicians that they've had running China. And so if I might make a broader issue here, we're coming to the end of 500 years of an economic era. So 500 years ago, we get the Europeanisation of the world, which is why we're in blackfella country, but most of us in this room have got white faces. So white people moved out of Europe and encircled the world and took it over for 500 years. That era is coming to an end. If you go back beyond 500 years, the two dominant economic powers in the world, from, say, the year one through until, say, a few centuries ago, were India and China. So what we're seeing is a resurgence of India and China back to the traditional positions which they've had. So in a sense, we in the Western world have had a good 500-year run, but we're now coming to the end of that run. And Xi is well aware of that. He's got a great sense of history, and he knows that it's now China's turn to bounce back.
We have a question from the audience there.
Oh. So it was interesting you're talking about classical democracy in Greece, and I was lucky enough to go to the Smithsonian one time, and I saw one of the original voting machines that they had, which was in fact choosing people randomly. And so Plato argued that the only people who should be excluded from the ballot were those people who wanted the job. And and also you talked about the fact that the Senate in the US sort of acts like a jury for impeachment. So maybe we would get a better House of Review in Australia if we had random selection of senators. So like a jury. What do you think about that?
Very good question. It will certainly get rid of the party system as well. The value of the party system is that it maintains order in Parliament. If you ended up with 100, or in our case, 74 individuals who are just randomly selected, it'd be very difficult to have party discipline and that sort of thing. But it would certainly be a completely different sort of Senate. And you could argue that in the United States, that's what they originally intended. Parties came along later. George Washington said the party system is going to destroy American politics. So yes, maybe just selecting people at random. George Will, the American commentator, said, look, he'd much rather go by the top 100 names selected at random from the white pages of New York or any other city, rather than having machine-type politicians. And we do have a problem with politicians in this country. It's a very narrow gene pool from which we're drawing our politicians, and they tend to work their way up either through a trade union movement or as a research officer in the case of Tony Abbott. So you don't get a good wide view of people who are experienced. I realise we've got a few ex-politicians in the audience, but I believe in telling truth to power. So I think that we need to find ways of getting a broader range of people involved in politics.
Dr. Suter, question coming in thick fast.
Oh, sorry.
I want to try and get through as many as possible.
Right.
This one is a very popular question because there's about 10 people that have already liked it. You talked about the Arab Spring. So how much does the suppression women contribute to Arab countries' ability to maintain their lack of democracy? Absolutely,
and it's a real challenge for the future of Islam generally, that we have got ourselves involved in a stupid Islamic struggle. It's really not our responsibility. The Islamic world has got a series of tensions they've got to resolve. Sunni and Shia rivalry is one. The other one is the role of women within Islamic society. So when you try to educate it within some traditional Islamic societies, you end up like Malala, being shot in the head. So I think we could do a lot more to educate women. Also, the more educated a woman is, the fewer children she will have. And so actually education becomes a good contraception which deals with the population problem, which is a real problem in the Middle East. There are too many young people running around.
Just a sort of an overall question, given everything you've talked about, the trade wars and, of course, the rise of China and even the Arab Spring, how does all of this affect the way that we should be thinking about the future of financial markets and the security of member savings?
Well, I'm so glad I'm not having to give people financial advice, because I really wouldn't know what financial advice to give, because the world is going through so many big issues. That's why I'm saying we've got to have a mechanism for reading broadly and learning widely about these changes that are going to reduce the risk of being taken by surprise. It's very difficult to make predictions, but I think you can reduce the risk of being taken by surprise. I've touched on some of those issues. Another one is the whole impact of information technology and how that's going to be transforming people's lives, the loss of jobs, etc. These are all big issues. And so I would, as I do this, working with people over a long term, just getting them to understand the basic drivers of change. Too often our media, you and I are both guilty of this, we focus on the surface issues, but there are deeper forces at work. Information technology, obviously, problems with democracy. These are the ones that need to be studied in depth to really get your head around. That's why I like Steve Bannon. You know, he does talk about these deeper issues, and ABC Four Corners is brilliant for getting to see how he fears about the future of America.
Yeah, thanks for giving it a good plug. You've certainly given it a great plug today. Now, have the Rust Belt voters stayed the course? It appears that for every industry that Trump has liberated, the losers have outnumbered the winners.
Absolutely. Well, I think that what is happening is that Trump cannot bring jobs back to the United States. If I were an American president, I would be focusing on the need for retraining, perhaps even encouraging some people to move out of West Virginia, or looking at how you reinvent the economy. This is also my argument about Australia. The growth in Australia is in the social sector, health, education, welfare. Not so much in manufacturing, which is going to be done by robots, or digging up coal necessarily, which we're seeing in West Virginia. Australia, I think, is different because we've got good quality coal here, much more so than West Virginia. But I think the challenge for the United States is that they need to be thinking differently and focusing more on re-education and getting people to do training programs. I think there are still plenty of jobs out there. If you want to be employed anywhere in the world, get a training as a nurse. Global shortage of nurses. The jobs are there, but you've just got to think differently.
Okay, I'm going to end on this question. If there was compulsory voting in the United States, as we have here in Australia, what outcomes do you think we would see, and do you think this will ever happen?
Well, let me just say, that's a question which I set my students at Boston University, who are amazed that it's compulsory to vote. Right, because Americans don't do anything under compulsion, including wearing seatbelts. So what is interesting is that when they have to talk about compulsory voting, their first question is always, don't even bother to think about it. Americans will not accept the idea of compulsory voting. And when they look at it in the Australian context, they say, well, you're still dissatisfied with your politicians, even though you do have compulsory voting. So there must be deeper issues involved. That's why I go back to the issue of globalisation. That politicians come to office, but they don't necessarily come to power. I think there are deeper issues involved rather than just electoral systems. I would like to see compulsory voting in America, but it's an actual non-starter. My students tell me that every time I set that as an exam question.
It's just never going to happen. Well, there you go. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together, Dr. Keith Suter.